Hello everyone, and welcome to ODIN, Open Dialogue and Ideas and News. Today we have me, Rich, as well as Max.
Hi everybody.
Addison.
Hey, what's up?
And Eric.
How's it going?
So, earlier this week, I realized I needed to start paying attention to my thought patterns a little more than usual, because I have been rationalizing a lot. I don't really know exactly how I became aware of it, but I was having a conversation with one of my roommates and realized that I was just defending my point because it was like a thought pattern I had. And then I made, careful note of that and decided to pay more attention to it, and I came across a huge area of my life that I'd been rationalizing. It's actually strange to think about because I've probably been doing it a lot longer than I can even be aware of. And the rationalization I told myself is that I'm an introvert. And while it's true to some degree, I do prefer my alone time, but I also prefer time with other people. I think I use this as an excuse not to talk to people in the middle of the day, because it's been an interesting culture where I think it's not very common for people to walk up to each other who are complete strangers in the middle of the day and introduce themselves. And I realized that it's something I'd really like to do, because I'd like to connect with more people and not rely on my social group to do so. And as I paid attention to this thought that I'm an introvert and I don't like doing this, I realized I was only saying that because it made me feel uncomfortable.
Yeah, and I think the trickiest part about it to me is how do you even begin to notice what you're rationalizing? You have to pay very close attention. You can be rationalizing things. It's almost like unconscious in a way until you can really pinpoint a concrete example.
I mean, I guess that's what rationalization is when your brain comes up with an explanation for some behavior and that you believe, that you think, because it's what your brain has come up with, that isn't in line necessarily with your actual motives or the actual thought process or a realistic sort of understanding of what's going on. And so I think that's why rationalization is a pretty interesting topic for us to explore, because it's a mental phenomenon that sort of by nature we're not really aware of as it happens.
Yeah, whether we want to believe it or not, most of the decisions we make throughout the day are completely unconscious. And we as humans that believe we have a lot of agency in this world don't like that. So whenever we realize we've done something without specific reasons, we'll come up with a reason for that in our minds.
Whoa there. It almost feels like you're suggesting that we don't have free will.
We're not going that direction today.
Okay, but I mean, I think that's a lot of what rationalization is. It's almost a way to preserve your sense of free will, because I'm not exactly sure if we have free will or not, but it's better to believe that we do.
Is it a question of free will or a defense of the ego? It seems like we rationalize because it keeps our story complete, the story we tell ourselves. I am rich and I am doing this thing and I made this decision because whatever. Even though I had no actual reason, I just wanted to make sure my friends thought I had a reason.
Yeah, and that's something that you actually see a lot with in science. In scientific textbooks, a lot of the time, science is portrayed to be this really continuous, logical progression of gathering facts and formulating hypotheses, when a lot of the times it's really serendipitous. People make discoveries they weren't intending to and mess things up along the way, but figure other things out.
Yeah, there's the part about telling a story to ourselves, and there's also the part about us just believing that the world is a rational place. And we have to if you really think about it, there's so many reasons for one thing to happen. Like, say you're driving down the road and you hit a squirrel. Like, you could think that, oh no, I hit that squirrel because I was not paying attention, looking at my phone. That was the only reason I hit that squirrel. And that's the only way I could have prevented hitting that squirrel, is if I was staring at the road. But really, if you had just not gotten in the car that day, you also wouldn't have hit that squirrel. There's just so many different reasons coming together for any one single thing to happen.
And if the squirrel didn't have a terrible family situation, he wouldn't have been running away from home and gotten killed. So,
So I always see rationalization almost as a way to just mitigate thoughts that we don't have the time to think about right now, or mitigate
Like a
tougher
heuristic.
problems. Yeah, essentially almost like a triaging of problems. Like if there's something you can't explain necessarily, you might just come up with some quick rationalization for it, and even if it doesn't quite make sense or doesn't reflect your true motives, it's a way to just put that problem aside for now and focus on other things.
And it gives your brain just what you were saying a second ago, Addison, a story that for what's going on that allows the broader story of, I guess, your life and daily experience to continue on fairly uninterrupted. If you were really confronted with a weird situation in which you make an odd decision, and then that you don't really know why you made, and then you were paralyzed and thought, I don't know why I made that decision. Let me explore all the consequences, all the possible reasons why. That could really slow you down if it's something that doesn't matter. Like, why did I pick vanilla ice cream over chocolate ice cream? Having a nice little explanation to keep you going can be in many ways a positive thing.
Or you could see a therapist about it and spend 6 hours, talking about how what your uncle did to you when you were 4 just influenced your ice cream decision making.
Yeah. And maybe it did.
Well, and that's where I think it gets really complex too, because on one hand, it's helpful because we don't have to explore exactly why we did everything, but do we even have to do that in the first place? Is the question. Is that the opposite of rationalization? Is extreme rationality and exploration, or is the other option just to say, I don't know why I did that. It just happened.
I think it's the opposite would be the I don't know why. Because rationalization, you can even if you go like to the depths of who you are as a person, you're still trying to rationalize the situation. And so I think the opposite would be that complete, I'm probably going to screw up what this term actually means, but like that Zen Buddhism where you're kind of just like going with the flow and interacting with your surroundings and letting your body.
A little more Taoist, but Buddhist, but
right,
we'll
Taoist,
give you a pass. Carry on.
All right.
Carry on, Peon. You may continue to use your words. They are ill-spoken.
I always have to check my terms. I'm a person that really definitely likes when I encounter something and I don't know why I've done it, I become excited and I'll like just sit there or think, like keep it till later and then just lay in my bed for like 3 hours examining like who I am as a person, why I made these decisions. And people have called me out for it. They say, why are you in your head so much? Because they think it's worthless to like really discover the reasons why you do these little things. Sometimes I think that they're completely wrong and that that's the best part about life is to uncovering who you are. But I've recently realized I do it a little too much and that I could be doing more productive things. So it's something I'm grappling with right now as well.
I feel like there's a balance. There's definitely a balance to be had between the decisiveness that is necessary in order to function and get through life. And I think this applies particularly towards leadership, because often when you're in a leadership position and you have to make decisions, you don't always know what to do. Oftentimes you're not going to know what to do, but everybody's looking up to you to make a decision. And there are times where it's absolutely correct to say, I don't know, or to try and appeal towards other means, trying to ask other people and work with them. But sometimes if it is something more trivial, or it just comes a time for somebody needing to be, step in and take a leadership role. It's saying, okay, we're going to do this. And, here's a reason, let's keep going.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a balance between that sort of decisiveness that is maybe what rationalization can allow, and also the deeper introspection that often leads to more self-understanding that comes from really trying to catch yourself when that happens.
So here's a question. Is rationalizing a good or a bad thing? Because, I mean, if you think about it from an evolutionary standpoint, it might be some glitch that we've developed or something, but it could also be a trait that we were naturally selected for.
And it probably is. For it to be a phenomenon that is pretty universal to human experience, it's there's likely a reason for it.
Do you think there was humans who just weren't rationalizing, and everyone's like, "Get this asshole out of here"?
Yeah, that's one thing that I want to talk about, is how we come up with these rationalizations partly because we need to explain our actions to other people. And if we don't have, if you go through life and say, I don't know why I did that, people are going to look at you like you're an idiot because they think they have reasons, even if they really don't.
Yeah. Also, I think if we were to take a step back and like hold ourselves to a strict rule and hold everybody to a strict rule of no rationalization, you must actually understand and have good motives for everything you do, I feel like 95% of all action would cease, you know? I really feel like so much of what we do is interacting with it and trying to make sense of and explore a world that is chaotic and that doesn't have rational answers for lots of things.
Well, it seems like what it is, you had mentioned it, Eric, that the triage problem is we have a problem occur, or some event goes on, and we make a rationalization, and then we put that there, and if anything in the future relates to that, we remember the decision we made previously. And it's a really quick reference point that lets us know, like, oh yeah, that's like a little axiom I made.
Yeah.
And now I can just keep going. So that's why it becomes tricky to start to undo or pay attention to what axioms of yours are rationalizations versus which ones have been well thought out or are actually healthy and useful for you.
Yeah.
And I'm not even saying that a rationalization isn't healthy and useful, but I do think that it's worth noting.
Yeah.
At the least.
I gotta say, this is my number one sales point for monogamy.
Yeah.
If you have a close partner who you spend like nearly all of your time with, and you know when you're older, you eventually have the same house, so you're spending almost all of your time together. You start to notice weird things that they do, and you're like, why do you do that? And they're like,
I don't
know. and they'll start to notice weird things about you, and it's like we have this thing that we do as humans where we check each other's behavior, and then we ask for their answer why you did that, and be like, oh, okay, that makes sense. That doesn't make sense.
Yeah. And in a lot of ways, that sort of external feedback can be pretty necessary in order to actually identify when you're rationalizing behavior, because it by nature of rationalization, it's very difficult to tell when you're doing it. I want to go back a minute because I think that we've identified a couple different kinds of rationalization. And to answer your question, Rich, when is rationalization good and when is rationalization bad? I think that can kind of break down along these lines. Because I think sometimes rationalization is when we genuinely don't know what to do in a situation and need to react and act. And then other times are when you have other motives. One that you identified, Rich, was discomfort about a situation. Often emotional motives or other reasons that are causing you to act irrationally, that are causing you to make what might be the wrong decision because you're either uncomfortable about something, as you said, your ego is taking over, and those sorts of things cause you to make decisions in accordance with your emotions, in accordance with other principles, and then make yourself think that you're acting logically when you're actually not. And I think that's a sort of rationalization that people more often think of when they think of it as being negative. And I think that that's what you were identifying for yourself in your life.
It does seem like a lot of the times, I'll generalize and then I'll give my specific story because I think a specific story helps really make things a little more relevant. On the general aspect, it seems as if rationalizations that may be unhealthy tend to be the ones where you are hiding shame or guilt from yourself.
Mm-hmm. You're keeping data from you trying to figure out the true reason of something happening. Like if you were doing a scientific study and you just didn't like a certain part of the data, your results would not be accurate.
Yeah, it's a little more of a willful ignorance to ignore your emotions like that. But it's also tricky because one of the things I realized with the whole telling myself I don't like approaching strangers in the daylight because it's not normal, it's weird, it's this, it's that, it makes me anxious, it makes me uncomfortable. One of the things I realized was, no, it doesn't make me anxious. It makes me feel. And instead of paying attention to all the sensations in my stomach and spine and chest when I walk up to like a pretty girl on campus and start to talk to her, instead of paying attention to those, I've just been saying, "Oh, I'm anxious." And that's my rationalization. That's my axiom. I wouldn't feel my own emotions because I didn't want to. And it's just so mind-boggling how long I've ignored that. And that if I didn't, I'm still going out of my way to feel it because my modus operandi is to ignore it. And you could do that forever.
Right. So let's talk quickly about the different types of rationalization that we've talked about. So we've talked about rationalizing things to yourself, rationalizing things to other people. Have we talked about anything else?
I want to get in about, do you think we could talk, or do you think we as a society can rationalize things?
Oh, 100%. I think about eating meat. I think eating meat is one of the really big, and I eat meat. That's a huge rationalization in our society that we've accepted it as being, oh, it's okay, when if you really try and unpack it and look at the meat industry and the amount of suffering that it generates, it's hard to come up with a real logical argument for that eating lots of meat is moral. Well, I think that's an example of rationalization.
To me, the logical distinction in that is, do you actually believe that an animal's life is worth as much as a human life? And people disagree on that. But.
Well, what I mean to say is I think that there are genuine arguments as to, not to get too off track on a specific issue, but I think that there are genuine arguments for why it's okay for people to generally eat meat in society. I think it would be very difficult to construct an argument that eating meat is completely morally, fine. And that's kind of how we regard it in our society generally.
And necessary. We treat it as necessary.
Yeah. We treat it as, this is just what we do. This is what our culture is. And that's true to a great extent. Yeah. And I think we rationalize it because it would be too hard for us to collectively confront the fact that we have these huge, urge to eat meat because it's so good with our also moral.
It's so good for your brain.
Yeah, it's so tasty.
I think it's important to hit on that a lot of these things we've gone over is us rationalizing why we stay in the same pattern and our willingness to, was it homeostasis? We want to be in homeostasis throughout our entire lives, basically.
I like that a lot. The idea of rationalization is a motive is just our brains have patterns that we know, our brains have, cause us to have patterns of behavior that work well enough for one way or the other. And then it's very difficult for us to want to shy away from those. And it's easy. Yeah. It's very easy to come up with reasons why not to try and change from our pattern.
I just came up with a huge dig against the Conservative Party, if you want to hear it.
Go for it.
Eric, our resident conservative. That just conservatism in general is a homeostasis rationalization.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it absolutely is.
But that's not necessarily such a bad thing.
Yeah.
It's
trusting what's worked before.
Yeah.
Because homeostasis is important. If we didn't have homeostasis, we'd probably be diabetics. So, it's
doesn't every single cell in our body work all the time to maintain homeostasis?
Yeah, it's a good thing.
Yeah. I think that in many ways is an argument for the validity of rationalization, in that, it's as a entity, the conservative aspects of society preserve what works and are necessary because, as we've mentioned many times, the world is a very chaotic system, and breaking away from homeostasis can allow things to devolve into chaos really quickly.
Yeah, and I guess that's the hard part about figuring out if you're rationalizing something is what you were saying is they try to preserve homeostasis, but at the same time you can try to preserve something that you should let go. Everybody needs to burn the dead wood off.
Or you can just cover yourself in formaldehyde forever.
So since we're starting to get into that, why do you guys think, or how, as a society and as an individual, can we tell when our rationalizations are bad or useful?
I think I've got a good one, and I'm gonna appeal to one of my favorite people. That's my boy Carl Jung here, and I've been reading about some of his work on personality and his work on trying to typify personality. If you guys have ever heard of Myers-Briggs, that's pretty popular. That's all based off of his work in basically typifying people as by which cognitive traits they tend to use. And I've been reading a lot about Myers-Briggs, and I wanted to go a little bit deeper. And I went to Jung's actual research, and I found out Myers-Briggs, it just seems like such a watered down version of this guy's psychology, because it's really scary when you read it, because he's very sort of restricting people to he has a very much more severe perspective on our cognitive limitations. But
he doesn't think we have a whole lot of free will. It sounds like.
Yeah, he basically what he and this is my interpretation of reading part of a book, so bear with me. But he breaks down 4 major or primary cognitive functions, and those are thinking, which is taking information and logically ordering it in order to come to conclusions. Feeling, which is more relying on value systems, more so necessarily than emotions, but also emotions, but relying on value systems to order information and make decisions. He described those 2 as rational functions, because those are, trying to take information towards a rational conclusion by some system of thought. And then the irrational ones were sensing, which is basically just reacting to your sensory stimuli in sort of order of how it affects you. That's probably the one I have the least apt definition for. And then intuition, which is more or less your unconscious mind sending you images, sending you connections between disparate phenomenon that might not have an immediately clear logical connection, but they nonetheless recognize patterns and guides you. So Jung describes these 4 cognitive functions, 2 of them rational, 2 of them deal with taking in information and having some kind of a structure by which that information is analyzed to some sort of a conclusion. And then these other 2, the irrational ones, sensing and intuition, he describes as irrational because they're not taking in information and applying some sort of real structure to them. You're in sensing, you're reacting to your senses, and in intuition, basically your subconscious is just throwing you patterns and connections between these things. But what I found so fascinating reading this is that he did not present the rational ones as being superior to the irrational ones, or the irrational ones as being bad at all. He basically explained that the rational ones are going to be really effective at dealing with aspects of the world that can be modeled through those means, either through some sort of a logical system or through a value structure. And he describes that there are aspects of life that kind of mental processes are going to be really effective at dealing with, figuring out a math problem, figuring out how you should act in a social situation, all of that. But he also stressed that a lot of it is super chaotic, and we have no idea what's going on. And that if you try and apply thinking or logical thought or a value system to certain aspects of life, and it was really kind of describing it as half and half of what existence is, they're not going to be effective. They're going to fall apart. And that is where these other cognitive traits come in of sensing and intuition. And so getting back to the question of what makes rationalization good or bad, I think that when your brain genuinely doesn't know what to do in a situation, and if you're dealing with some sort of a chaotic thing, And more realistically, it's applying to your senses or intuition or whatever to come up with something to do, and then the rationalization is basically just keeping the thinking part of your brain happy, making it think that it's still doing something.
Yeah.
Then I
giving it a participation trophy.
Exactly. I would say that sort of rationalization usually isn't super harmful. But the other side is where bad rationalization comes in is, I think, when there is a genuine rational solution or a rational better way of dealing with a situation, but your ego or your emotions or whatever cause you to do something that's genuinely not what the rational answer is that your brain does have access to. That's when rationalization, I think, falls down and can be really negative.
Another way I've heard the functions described that I think might shed even some more light on what you're trying to say is the irrational ones, sensing and intuition, are sometimes described as observing functions, and feeling and thinking are described as deciding functions. And if you look at that as deciding, like you've decided the factors that are going to actually have an outcome or produce an outcome in this situation, then you're limiting everything else, every other possibility from influencing that situation. Whereas if you're observing, you're always open to these new ideas and possibilities of what could be actually making you make this choice.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. I think part of our society puts a lot more focus on the rational parts, whereas I think that's why you're surprised that Jung kind of sees it as 50-50. And I think that this is something that I struggle with personally because, I majored in physics. I like order, logic, reason, and all these things. And, it's hard to tell myself sometimes I want to go to the arcade this weekend or something stupid like that isn't like work-based or something like that, and just say, this isn't rational, but I want to do it, and I'm going to do it. And I don't think that's I think it's better to just admit, I don't know why I want to do this. I feel like it. Yeah. I'm going to do this. But I mean,
however, and when you're in those modes too, if you went to the arcade, I've noticed that a lot of times when people do those spontaneous things, they're more open to another possibility coming in. Like maybe you'll meet someone there that could help you a lot with your work, because you're just in that frame of mind instead of being, okay, I'm on this task, I have to accomplish this and this and this.
Yeah, and kind of embracing that spontaneity gives you that, and like, I don't know, might give you that feeling like I actually want to walk up and talk to somebody in the middle of the day for no reason.
Yeah, the world is full of possibilities.
Yeah.
So I generally agree with what everybody said, although I do have a couple of hang-ups that I'd like to address. I guess I'll start with Max. I guess the one you discussed, what we quote, it's hard. I don't like framing it as good or bad rationality, but I do understand what you guys mean by those points. It's hard to put like a moral structure over the inner workings of our mind, but it's what we do because it's the way our language is structured. One of the things I noticed was we focused on quote-unquote bad rationality being when something actually has a rational problem, like a rational solution, but you don't address it, you just ignore it, or you have a thought pattern that lets you ignore it. I would also just add on to that a lot of times I think it involves ignoring our own true feelings about something, which isn't rational, but it can be uncomfortable or it can be different. We're not always used to really paying attention to ourselves because it's so easy to put a thought in place of an emotion.
And yeah, I actually agree. And I think that in applying a sort of dichotomy between rationalizing being like more for the emotional and thinking versus sensing and intuition, I think it goes further than that. I think rationalization kind of represents the tyranny of thinking. It represents the tyranny of the logical aspects of our brain and having that function supersede the other necessary elements of our brain, like you just said, feeling being one of them as well.
And then the other thing I had noticed too was Eric used the phrase, I feel like it. Like, I want to go to the arcade because I feel like it, which is generally a very true thing. Like, you can be in a state where you have this sense or intuition that you would like to do something and you can't explain why with your mind. But that's one of the phrases that's strange to me, because a lot of times people say I feel a certain way and it doesn't relate to an emotion at all. Like, I feel like that guy is a douchebag. And it's just, I just say for anyone listening to be careful and not think that because you use the words I feel before you described an action that it means you're actually paying attention to your emotions.
Yeah.
This is one of the things I've analyzed about myself. I definitely use I feel when it is an intuitive thing. Like, I know it has nothing to do with feelings, and then I use I think when I've pre-thought through something.
Mm-hmm.
So it's weird how we connect feeling with intuition, though, because they really aren't exactly the same.
Start saying I intuit.
Yeah.
I intuit this man is not to the quality
And get your
of
glasses
people I would like
broken.
to spend time with.
Going back to what Rich, you were saying about just trying to call rationalization either good or bad. I guess I'd want to refine the good bad dichotomy to be more pragmatic, to be
Helpful, not helpful.
yeah, helpful or not helpful, or moves you towards greater well-being or away from greater well-being would be the way. And I think I want to bring this back to Jung also, is that I think what is not helpful, the unhelpful rationalization that you can do, is like what you were saying, Rich, when you're rationalizing because you're feeling shame or guilt. And I mean, if you did something really bad and you really should change your behavior, you should feel guilty, of course. But if you're rationalizing something and not changing your behavior to hide feelings of shame and guilt, you're repressing your shadow. You're not allowing yourself to properly integrate, like, I don't know, your aggression or your personality traits that may generally be seen as more negative, but may have some hidden value.
I think even with the useful and not useful for our well-being, we're doing a trick of speech where we're still giving that dichotomy of a logical 1 or 0.
Yeah.
And I think what we really have to understand about, let's say, the observing functions and embracing irrationality is that the only way to rationalize, I don't even know what to say. The only way to overcome rationalization is just to observe all possibilities and know as much as you can about yourself or whatever you're dealing with. Because if you try to like make one thing good or bad, then if you do the bad thing, you're going to still rationalize it whether you want to or not. You just have to accept that that is who you are and maybe not even put a good or bad label on it.
Yeah, I like that. And I think that this gets to an idea that rationalization, I think we've framed it a couple times as it being positive or it being okay to rationalize something when you genuinely don't have an answer for a situation. When, say, there's not a rational framework for dealing with a problem, and you have to appeal to some irrational aspects of your brain. Earlier I said that I sort of saw that as being okay rationalization, but I'm changing that. I disagree with past Max because I think that gets in the way of realistically valuing your functions for what they are. And I think it would be better in that sort of situation to just realize, oh, I don't actually know what to do in this situation, or I don't have a rational answer for how I should act here. That's okay. That's a lot of life. I've got these other things that I can rely on in order to help me with that. And to just be able to, I think it would be better to just sort of sit with that feeling, realize it, pay more attention to those other aspects of your being, and then move forward. You know?
I like that a lot, actually. That does fit well, because I was trying to think about how I wanted to word what Addison said, because I did have some kind of confusion, or I had a stick point with the whole idea of breaking it up into good or bad, or some kind of dichotomy.
Yeah.
But the way you mentioned observing, when you find something that you can't explain, you observe. It's all you that's all you have to do is observe.
Yeah, it's almost like meditating. You're just getting all the deciding thoughts out of your head.
Oh yeah, I feel like that ties straight into non-attachment of not being worried about, or not obsessing over the outcome of an action, not obsessing over getting it right or wrong, but realizing the situations in which we don't know.
And also not being so attached to your own ego.
Yeah.
Because it takes a lot of humility to admit that you either don't know something, or it takes even more humility to admit you were rationalizing something and trying to cover up for the fact that you don't know something. and that's something like humility. A lot of these traits, good moral traits that people can have, or good traits that can help you get to a place where you have a healthy psyche that keeps you happy. A lot of them act like muscles where you have to really practice them, and you do have to kind of practice humility in a sense, admitting that you don't know.
And I think that really keys into what you're talking about in integrating the shadow, because I think that a lot of rationalization occurs from either thinking that the world is more logical than it is, or thinking that you have a better understanding of a rational understanding of the world and what to do than you actually do. And one of the ways that manifests itself is people adhering to ideologies or adhering to groupthink when they haven't actually really thought through or explored those decisions. And a lot of the individuation process that Carl Jung describes, if you want a quick, what's it called? Primer on what that is, go listen to one of our previous podcasts where we talked about that. But this individuation process, a lot of it is breaking from ideologies, breaking from identifying with groupthink, and actually thinking through things yourself. And that means confronting and realizing that maybe I believed in something that actually doesn't have a lot of merit, isn't actually thought through. And maybe the reason why I believed in that was because, I genuinely didn't know on my own, and that was scary, and it was easier to go with an ideology rather than confront not knowing.
Yeah.
Well, with all that said, I really think we've covered the topic of rationalization pretty well, and this would be a decent place to end the episode. So thank you, everyone, for listening.
For more information on ODIN, check out our social media linked in the description below. If you'd like to attend a discussion, check us out on Facebook. We frequently update our events there. If you'd like to start a show or pitch a topic, send us an email at odinspeak@gmail.com. That's ODIN speak@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.